Section 20 of History of Egypt, Volume 1, by Gaston Maspero. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 3. The Legendary History of Egypt, Part 4. The three gods who preceded Osiris upon the throne had ceased to reign, but not to live. Ra had taken refuge in heaven, disgusted with his own creatures; Shu had disappeared in the midst of a tempest, and Sibu had quietly retired within his palace when the time of his sojourning upon earth had been fulfilled. Not that there was no death, for death too, together with all other things and beings, had come into existence in the beginning, but while cruelly persecuting both man and beast, had for a while respected the gods. Osiris was the first among them to be struck down, and hence to require funeral rites. He was also the first for whom family piety sought to provide a happy life beyond the tomb. Though he was king of the living and the dead at Mendes by virtue of the rights of all the feudal gods in their own principalities, his sovereignty after death exempted him no more than that of the meanest of his subjects from that painful torpor into which all mortals fell on breathing their last. But popular imagination could not resign itself to his remaining in that miserable state for ever. What would it have profited him to have Isis the great sorceress for his wife, the wise Horus for his son, two master magicians, Thought the ibis and the jackal Anubis for his servants, if their skill had not availed to ensure him a less gloomy and less lamentable after-life than that of men? Anubis had long before invented the art of mummifying, and his mysterious science had secured the everlasting existence of the flesh, but at what a price! For the breathing, warm, flesh-coloured body, spontaneous in movement and function, was substituted an immobile, cold, and blackish mass, a sufficient basis for the mechanical continuity of the double, but which that double could neither raise nor guide, whose weight paralysed and whose inertness condemned it to vegetate in darkness, without pleasure and almost without consciousness of existence. Thought, Isis, and Horus applied themselves, in the case of Osiris, to ameliorating the discomfort and constraint entailed by the more primitive embalmment. They did not dispense with the manipulations instituted by Anubis, but endued them with new power by means of magic. They inscribed the principal bandages with protective figures and formulas; they decorated the body with various amulets of specific efficacy for its different parts; they drew numerous scenes of earthly existence and of the life beyond the tomb upon the boards of the coffin, and upon the walls of the sepulchral chamber. When the body had been made imperishable, they sought to restore, one by one, all the faculties of which their previous operations had deprived it. The mummy was set up at the entrance to the vault; the statue representing the living person was placed beside it, and semblance was made of opening the mouth, eyes, and ears, of loosening the arms and legs, of restoring breath to the throat and movement to the heart. The incantations by which these acts were severally accomplished were so powerful that the god spoke and ate, lived and heard, and could use his limbs as freely as though he had never been steeped in the bath of the embalmer. He might have returned to his place among men, and various legends prove that he did occasionally appear to his faithful adherents. But, as his ancestors before him, he preferred to leave their towns, and withdraw into his own domain. The cemeteries of the inhabitants of Busiris and of Mendes were called Sokhit Alu, the meadow of the reeds, and Sokhit Hatpu, the meadow of the best. They were secluded amid the marshes, in small archipelagoes of sandy islets where the dead bodies, piled together, rested in safety from the inundations. This was the first kingdom of the dead Osiris, but it was soon placed elsewhere, as the nature of the surrounding districts and the geography of the adjacent countries became better known, at first perhaps on the Phoenician shore beyond the sea, and then in the sky, in the Milky Way, between the north and the east, but nearer to the north than to the east. This kingdom was not gloomy and mournful like that of the other dead gods, Sokaris or Contamentit, but was lighted by sun and moon; the heat of the day was tempered by the steady breath of the north wind, and its crops grew and throve abundantly. Thick walls served as fortifications against the attacks of Sit and evil genii; a palace like that of the Pharaohs stood in the midst of delightful gardens, and there among his own people Osiris led a tranquil existence, enjoying in succession all the pleasures of earthly life, without any of its pains. The goodness which had gained him the title of Onophris while he sojourned here below, inspired him with the desire and suggested the means of opening the gates of his paradise to the souls of his former subjects. Souls did not enter into it unexamined, nor without a trial. Each of them had first to prove that during its earthly life it had belonged to a friend, or, as the Egyptian texts have it, to a vassal of Osiris, Amakhu Kir Osiri, one of those who had served Horus in his exile and had rallied to his banner from the very beginning of the Typhonian wars. These were the followers of Horus, Shosuu Horu, so often referred to in the literature of historic times. Horus, their master, having loaded them with favours during life, decided to extend to them after death the same privileges which he had conferred upon his father. He convoked around the corpse the gods who had worked with him at the embalmment of Osiris, Anubis and Thot, Isis and Nephthys, and his 4 children, Hapi, Kabsonuf, Amsit, and Tiamat, to whom he had entrusted the charge of the heart and viscera. They all performed their functions exactly as before, repeated the same ceremonies, and recited the same formulas at the same stages of the operations, and so effectively that the dead man became a real Osiris under their hands, having a true voice, and henceforth combining the name of the god with his own. He had been Sakhomka or Menkauri, he became Osiris Sakhomka or the Osiris Menkauri, true of voice. Horus and his companions then celebrated the rites consecrated to the opening of the mouth and the eyes, animated the statue of the deceased, and placed the mummy in the tomb, where Anubis received it in his arms. Recalled to life and movement, the double reassumed, one by one, all the functions of being, came and went and took part in the ceremonies of the worship which was rendered to him in his tomb. There he might be seen accepting the homage of his kindred, and clasping to his breast his soul under the form of a great human-headed bird, with features the counterpart of his own. After being equipped with the formulas and amulets wherewith his prototype, Osiris, had been furnished, he set forth to seek the field of reeds. The way was long and arduous, strewn with perils to which he must have succumbed at the very first stages, had he not been carefully warned beforehand and armed against them. A papyrus placed with the mummy in its coffin contained the needful topographical directions and passwords, in order that he might neither stray nor perish by the way. The wiser Egyptians copied out the principal chapters for themselves, or learned them by heart while yet in life, in order to be prepared for the life beyond. Those who had not taken this precaution studied after death the copy with which they were provided, and since few Egyptians could read, a priest or relative of the deceased, preferably his son, recited the prayers in the mummy's ear, that he might learn them before he was carried away to the cemetery. If the double obeyed the prescriptions of the Book of the Dead to the letter, he reached his goal without fail. On leaving the tomb he turned his back on the valley, and, staff in hand, climbed the hills which bound it on the west, plunging boldly into the desert, where some bird, or even a kindly insect such as a praying mantis, a grasshopper, or a butterfly, served as his guide. Soon he came to one of those sycamores which grow in the sand far away from the Nile, and are regarded as magic trees by the Fellahin. Out of the foliage a goddess, Nuit, Athor, or Nit, half emerged, and offered him a dish of fruit, loaves of bread, and a jar of water. By accepting these gifts he became the guest of the goddess, and could never more retrace his steps without special permission. Beyond the sycamore were lands of terror, infested by serpents and ferocious beasts, furrowed by torrents of boiling water, intersected by ponds and marshes where gigantic monkeys cast their nets. Ignorant souls, or those ill prepared for the struggle, had no easy work before them when they imprudently entered upon it. Those who were not overcome by hunger and thirst at the outset were bitten by a urasus, or horned viper, hidden with evil intent below the sand, and perished in convulsions from the poison; or crocodiles seized as many of them as they could lay hold of at the fords of rivers; or cynocephaly netted and devoured them indiscriminately along with the fish into which the partisans of Typhon were transformed. They came safe and sound out of one peril only to fall into another, and infallibly succumbed before they were half through their journey. But, on the other hand, the double who was equipped and instructed, and armed with the true voice, confronted each foe with the phylactery and the incantation by which his enemy was held in check. As soon as he caught sight of one of them he recited the appropriate chapter from his book; he loudly proclaimed himself Ra, Tumu, Horus, or Khopri, that god whose name and attributes were best fitted to repel the immediate danger, and flames withdrew at his voice, monsters fled or sank paralysed, the most cruel of genii drew in their claws and lowered their arms before him. He compelled crocodiles to turn away their heads, he transfixed serpents with his lance, he supplied himself at pleasure with all the provisions that he needed, and gradually ascended the mountains which surrounded the world, sometimes alone, and fighting his way step by step, sometimes escorted by beneficent divinities. Halfway up the slope was the good cow Hathor, the Lady of the West, in meadows of tall plants where every evening she received the sun at his setting. If the dead man knew how to ask it according to the prescribed rite, she would take him upon her shoulders, and carry him across the accursed countries at full speed. Having reached the north, he paused at the edge of an immense lake, the Lake of Ka, and saw in the far distance the outline of the islands of the blessed. One tradition, so old as to have been almost forgotten in Ramesside times, told how Thoth the ibis there awaited him, and bore him away on his wings; another, no less ancient but of more lasting popularity, declared that a ferry boat plied regularly between the solid earth and the shores of Paradise. The god who directed it questioned the dead, and the bark itself proceeded to examine them before they were admitted on board, for it was a magic bark. "Tell me my name," cried the mast, and the travellers replied, "He who guides the great goddess on her way is thy name." "Tell me my name," repeated the braces. "The spine of the jackal Ua Pua Itu is thy name." "Tell me my name," proceeded the masthead. "The neck of Amsit is thy name." "Tell me my name," asked the sail. "Nuit is thy name." Each part of the hull and of the rigging spoke in turn and questioned the applicant regarding its name, this being generally a mystic phrase by which it was identified, either with some divinity as a whole, or else with some part of his body. When the double had established his right of passage by the correctness of his answers, the bark consented to receive him and to carry him to the further shores. There he was met by the gods and goddesses of the court of Osiris, by Anubis, by Hathor the lady of the cemetery, by Nit, by the two Maites who preside over justice and truth, and by the 4 children of Horus stiff sheathed in their mummy wrappings. They formed, as it were, a guard of honour to introduce him and his winged guide into an immense hall, the ceiling of which rested on light graceful columns of painted wood. At the further end of the hall Osiris was seated in mysterious twilight within a shrine, through whose open doors he might be seen wearing a red necklace over his close-fitting case of white bandaging, his green face surmounted by the tall white diadem flanked by 2 plumes, his slender hands grasping flail and crook, the emblems of his power. Behind him stood Isis and Nephthys watching over him with uplifted hands, bare bosoms, and bodies straitly cased in linen. 42 jurors who had died and been restored to life like their lord, and who had been chosen, one from each of those cities of Egypt which recognized his authority, squatted right and left, and motionless, clothed in the wrappings of the dead, silently waited until they were addressed. End of Section 20. Read by Professor Heather and By. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.